Hi there, welcome to Boa 54. I am Hawa and this is Ordinary People Africa. Ordinary People is a series containing interviews of ordinary men and women of Africa beating the odds in and out of Africa. In this series, I will be collaborating with Dear Diaspora, hosted by Undu. Dear Diaspora is a podcast celebrating African diaspora, its change makers, innovators, and entrepreneurs working together to make the world the best place to live in. I would recommend checking out more of their content on your website at www.theirdiasporashow.com, and do check out the description box below for more information. Before we get started, if this is your first time, thank you for joining us. Our passion here at Boa 54 is to promote a positive Africa, one video at a time. If this sounds like anything you would love to be a part of, go ahead and join the family of Boa by hitting that subscribe button and notification bell next to it so you can keep learning about Africa and you don't miss anything. Also, most importantly, share this video and channel with your family and friends to help us promote a positive Africa. Be sure to check out Boa 54 merch. Every purchase that you make helps us produce this videos that you guys so much love. So let's get into the interview. A little disclaimer though, this is an audio interview, so take a listen.
I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my favorite podcasters, Andile Masuku. Andile is the co-founder of African Tech Roundup, and African Tech Roundup is a Johannesburg-based media and insights organization which tracks the progress of Africa's emerging digital, tech, and innovation industries. It's really how I stay plugged in to just all things, tech and, startup-wise, and just, innovation and just really cool things happening on the continent. So if you're not subscribed to African Tech Roundup, please do so and check it out. It's such a great podcast. So during the episode, we discuss what sparked his interest in technology, his upbringing in Zimbabwe, and his life now living in South Africa, his thoughts on the Mara Group. So they are behind the first cell phone to be totally manufactured in Africa. So I get his thoughts on that, and just also what he thinks about, China's presence on the continent, and, all the technology that they are deploying on the continent, and just all their moves on the continent. I got to, just pick his brain about what he thinks about that. So I really enjoyed this conversation. If you are interested at all in African tech and innovation, this is definitely the episode for you. And if you know anyone else that, is really super interested in this sort of content, please share this episode with them. Andile, thank you so much for being a guest on Dear Diaspora. I'm so excited to have you.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Yes, thank you for being on the show. I am a huge fan of your podcast, African Tech Roundup. It's one of the first podcasts I came across that just covered, just what's happening as far as innovation and technology goes on the continent. So I've learned a lot from it. And so thank you for that. So I wanted to,
and that's music to my ears. So you're part of the village.
Yes, totally. And so I wanted to get to know you a little bit more. And so I always start by asking, where did you grow up? And what was it like for you growing up in Zimbabwe? I know you were born there. And then I know that you also recently moved to South Africa. So I'd love to also hear about that.
Look, the older you get, the more, I suppose, sentimental you become about your upbringing, especially if you've been as blessed as I have to be raised by, both parents who, in my humble opinion, have done an excellent job at creating an enabling environment for my brothers and I to grow up and, find our strengths and, launch into the world. So, so forgive me if I'm a little sentimental, but I mean, for the most part, especially when I trade notes with other people who've had far less privilege in their lives, I realize every day just how blessed I was to be born in 1984 in a sort of post-independence Zimbabwe. Things hadn't quite properly settled down yet completely. I mean, there were still pockets of struggle in the country, and of course, it's a It's a difficult history for Zimbabwe, no doubt. I was born, it's around about the time I was born, but born in Bulawayo, my hometown. Shout out to you, Skies, Blues. I see you, fam. And so I'm born there. 18 months later, my family moves to Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe. And then I would spend 8 years of my life there before my family moved to the Philippines, where we spent 3 years before returning to Zimbabwe, where I went back to school, finished high school, and then left to study for a business degree at Helderberg College in the Western Cape, not too far from Cape Town in South Africa. Thereafter, I moved to Johannesburg and chose to stay there. And most of my professional career is rooted there.
Wow. And so what was it like going to school in the Western Cape?
Well, going to school in the Western Cape, sure. So my father studied for his master's degree at the same institution. And he studied there at a time when, Black folk were only allowed in certain places. When for the duration of the time he spent at Helderberg College, he wasn't allowed on the beach, which you can actually see from the campus, because it's at the foot of a mountain that sort of overlooks the beautiful Strand Beach in that. And so the whole time my father would have studied at Helderberg College, he would never have been allowed on that beach. And so
wow.
It was quite, it's quite moving to think that many years later I'd be studying at the same institution and allowed to freely walk that beach and enjoy it with everyone else. And then the sad irony, of course, is that the only time I've ever been called the N word to my face, I suppose there's a K word in South Africa, kafa, which is the equivalent to the N word in the US. The only time I've ever been called that word to my face was on that beach, Wow. So there's, I share that anecdote just to give you a sense of just how, things tend, in many ways things changed, and the world I was privileged to enjoy university in was so much different to the world my father had to study in. But in many ways, some things don't change.
Seriously. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's quite an interesting perspective. So thank you for sharing that with me and the audience. And so I guess was it an easy decision for you to move to actually relocate to South Africa as a professional because you went to school there?
So, yeah, I mean, by the time I finished my 4-year degree, I was pretty certain I wanted to stay in South Africa. In fact, at the time, I was pretty certain I wanted to stay in Cape Town, which is funny because I wouldn't want to live in Cape Town now. But yeah, no, it was a pretty easy decision. Zimbabwe at the time, I mean, this is circa, 2006 odd, So, I mean, if anyone who knows about Zimbabwe's more recent history will know that, 2006, 7, 8 especially, were just really tough years economically, politically for the country. And so no one in their right mind, at least at my age, 2021 at the time, would have wanted to return home and struggle through that. And so, yeah, I walked into my first job, which was a teaching role at a private Christian school. And this was my attempt to escape what I sensed would be, the career path my parents would enable me to access in Zimbabwe via their connections. They're very, well connected there as educators, as people who've spent most of their lives in Zimbabwe. I was probably going to be shooed into a decent sort of corporate role in Zimbabwe, doing something I didn't really want to do or wasn't passionate about. And so spending a year teaching sounded like a great way to spend my professional energies until I figured out what it was I did want to do, which again, I have to be humble to the fact that I don't think I've ever had anything be as difficult to do professionally as teaching before or since that experience. And so, yeah, that was a baptism of fire. I thought I was just going to sort of hang out for a year and then sort of figure myself out. But no, I was in for what would be, I think, one of the biggest challenges of my young professional life. Thankfully, it didn't last too long. My work permit didn't clear, and I eventually left that school before, before I could even start the second term. So it was just really 3 months of teaching, which taught me a lot. But then that led me to the next thing and the next thing. And before I knew it, I was sort of like a Joburg native. And yeah, the rest, as they say, is history, I guess.
Very cool. And so what would you say, or when did you start being really interested in like technology? Like what sparked that interest?
It's a good question. I suppose the assumption for someone who, happens upon the African Tech Roundup podcast in 2019 might be that I am this tech head who just, is inherently in love with technology and innovation and that kind of thing. And it's not that I'm not. It's just, I think, firstly, I'm just a really curious person, and I'm more fascinated with stories and how stories evolve. And I think technology has just become one of the biggest or most important proxies for how stories are told, how stories are perpetuated and broadcast, who gets to hear stories, who gets to tell them, who gets to participate in economic activity, who gets left out. And so from that standpoint, there's so much to be curious about and so much to be interested about in that space. And it's more that than it is, I grew up playing Game Boys and, I was that kid who opened up, like, every time I got a toy, I'd open it up and see how it works inside. I was never that kid. And growing up, yes, to be fair, I mean, my parents probably had one of the only computers in the neighborhood when I was a toddler, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I would not sort of point to that experience as being how I was put onto technology. I remember that computer for the most part staying off the whole time because I do come from an African house, an African home, a traditional African home, and that was Daddy's computer, and it only turned on when he said so, and then eventually my older brother had permission to turn it on once in a while, and for the most part it just stayed off, right? So no, it wasn't, but then I also, now that I reflect, we got television in our home pretty late. My parents visited the US on a trip and returned with the television set in 1990. I'll never forget that. And so perhaps the most influential technology in my life as a child would have been the television, and my fascination with this box and the voices that came from it and the pictures I saw there, and my fascination with how things got to be in the box, and who else had a box, and how cool it was to compare what other people had in their box, and you know what I mean, and there were places places I could go and watch things in boxes that I wasn't allowed to watch in our box. And, so from that standpoint, television and perhaps technology, even communications technology, is probably what got me going.
Okay. Yeah. And so, so when did you, I know you said you didn't necessarily grow up like a techie, but as you kind of grew like in your professional life, when did you decide to, like you're the co-founder of African Tech Roundup, like how did you meet the other co-founder, and what kind of drove you guys to starting the podcast?
So prior to launching the podcast, I had a pretty successful television career on screen and, behind the scenes, working in television in South Africa for what was then one of the most, what was the biggest sort of small business advice show, a business advice show. So this is before sort of Shark Tank and Dragon's Den became a big deal, at least in South Africa. They probably just launched in the US. And so I was on the show, and I'd already sort of broken into media, and yeah, I was feeling really good about myself and feeling really, I was sort of buying into the notion of being well known and being a celebrity and having, the privileges that come with that and a comfortable income, that kind of thing. Just feeling really self-satisfied. And the show I was working on at the time got cancelled. It was sponsored by a bank that basically paid all the bills, and so the production company that made the show didn't want to tick off the bank by taking the title to some other bank or to some other network, and so I was left in the wilderness, and that's when it kind of hit me for the first time just how, relatively speaking, dispensable I was as a talent, as a media person, and particularly as someone who didn't own the rights to and control the brand I was working on. And so, yeah, that was a rude awakening. And I suppose at the time I assumed, the next thing is just going to come along, and the next thing kind of didn't come along. And the things I was being offered at the time just didn't match what I was leaving behind or, what had just ended. And yeah, I went through a very humbling period where I sort of had to go back to, I sort of had to rediscover my personal passions and my personal sense of purpose around, why I was in the position I was, the privilege of it, the gift of it, the responsibility of it, and then also just figure out for myself what I actually enjoyed doing. As it happens, I didn't really enjoy being on television. I never have. I've never really enjoyed, I don't enjoy the makeup. I enjoy being the highest paid person in the crew, having the lights on me and pressure and forcing the smile. And I've just never enjoyed that. And as a child who had a speech impediment, television is actually the most stressful version of being a media person for me, because I totally have to bring a personality or a persona to screen in order to override what is essentially a child who used to stutter, Wow. And so television is really, really stressful. And and given the opportunity, I wouldn't do television, certainly wouldn't do it unless, I was doing something I really enjoyed or, that really mattered. And that show didn't really matter. And it wasn't really something I cared about deeply. Like I said, I'm a curious person. So I generally find, fun in doing a lot of different things. But at the point, 4 years into that show, I wasn't having fun anymore. It was a formula. I was comfortable, and it wasn't really, it wasn't giving me the latitude to grow as a person, none of that. So anyway, so all of this you start to reflect on all of this once the gig is over, and then you realize, well, the one thing I do really enjoy is, or one thing I've always been blessed with is a voice, and I'm a classically trained singer. I'm not the most amazing out there. I definitely need the training to be good enough to be heard in public, but I've always enjoyed the voice as it's always been my go-to for how I express and how I enjoy being seen. So dancers obviously enjoy the physicality of what they do, or people who makeup artists obviously enjoy, especially people who make up their own faces, enjoy sort of using their own faces as a platform for expressing. Fashion designers enjoy fashion. I have always enjoyed the voice and using it and manipulating it and tuning it, and not just mine but other people's as well. And so that's kind of how voiceover work had always been some of the most enjoyable work I did in media. And then I was like, yeah, but I'd never worked in radio. I'd never really done anything meaningful in radio or anything like that. I'd done some news reading and things like that, but nothing like, podcasting. And podcasting was kind of nascent at the time, and it was like, wow, you can really just be yourself on a mic, and if yourself isn't good enough, you can edit it. And it was just a fascinating medium for me as a stuttering child, remember, recovered stuttering child to discover, it was the first media platform that allowed me to be myself in a way that other things hadn't or wouldn't, so that's how I came to podcasting. And then the sort of tech thing was, I met a guy who, he had like a lot of tech enterprise experience. And yeah, he'd started like a publication, a newsletter that, that was serving, people of color, predominantly Africans, who just never had a voice before within the context of tech and innovation, and even enterprise tech and startups, certainly, and investments in the space and stuff. And it was a really popular newsletter, and I'd seen him do this. His name was Defo Mogapi. And I approached him and I was like, look, I've got the broadcasting chops. I've got, I'm really curious about the space. I'm interested enough, and I see what you have here. You have this amazing community and a deep understanding of the space. And what if you and I started a podcast together? And he agreed. Some years after that, we parted ways. He carried on with his platform. I carried on with the African Tech Roundup, and I later sort of hooked up with my Zambian co-founder, Musaka Lenga, who has is in the trenches with me now. So that's I suppose the long, sort of short version.
And I would love to kind of transition into some more, I guess, like tech-related questions. Some of my audience expressed an interest in discussing the new smartphones that are being like manufactured in Rwanda with the Mara Group. Have you been following that? And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yes, I have been following that development, and I'm excited. I'm as excited as any sort of good African should be that our sense of what's possible has been shifted by that development. If you're like me, growing up in Zimbabwe, you grew up just believing certain things weren't for you, just because you'd never seen Black folk execute on that, or you'd never seen them done in your country. And so I suppose, there's a generation of children who are going to grow up knowing that, you can have a smartphone factory in your town, and an entire smartphone you have in your pocket can be created without needing too many things from outside the African continent. I think that does a lot for a child's psyche, but also the collective African psyche. So that's on the idealistic, hopeful side of things. And then on the sort of pragmatic side of things, I hope the success lasts long enough for us to enjoy it and to see it sort of go from one generation to the next, because there are two reasons why, if you're skeptical or even cynical, you would look at this and go, this isn't going to work, or this isn't something I want to get too attached to. Firstly, there's Southeast Asia, namely China, and their sort of global monopoly on manufacturing, especially in the electronic space, right? It's a near monopoly. Yes, there's Korea and there's other people, but it's a near monopoly. And so when you think about sort of where Africa potentially, and I say this, Africa corporately and maybe Rwanda specifically, where it fits in the scheme of things within a global context, you wonder if there's any real competitive chance for a country like Rwanda to get in on the action. And then there's the other side of things where you're like, well, are we too late to the party? Is this playing into a narrative where Africa becomes the next sort of, factory of the world, the next China, as China becomes richer and wealthier and doesn't want to do all this sort of dirty, dusty work anymore? Is Africa where it's going to be? And is it going to happen in the same way China did it, in a mostly environmentally unfriendly and environmentally degrading way, is that the price we're going to need to pay in order to, participate in global economics.
Mm.
Then there's the other way you could look at it where you're like, well, perhaps this is also like a signal, a signaling occurrence that points to how, African nations are going to increasingly start thinking about their national interest before they put, global realities or their relationships with global entities before they take those into consideration. And I say this to mean Rwanda is, for better or for worse, and I mean it's got its, that their current president has his fans and his detractors, and for better or for worse, Rwanda is sort of making a name for what it looks like when an African nation puts itself before anyone else, on the global stage. So will the America says, I want to dump sort of used clothes on you. Rwanda says no. People come to the country and say, we want to operate, or we want to start startups, or we want to just pour sort of investment in this space. And the government says, nah, you need to deal with us before you do anything in the private space. We're not an entirely open economy for you to do whatever you want. And so, maybe this is a trend that's signaling how the rest of the continent might start to try and look for ways to position as self-sufficient as, putting our citizens' interests first before the rest of the world. And maybe this is a symbolic step in that direction. But that's me trying to 360 it. I just let you into my world, into how my mind works when I'm sort of prepping. If this topic ends up on the African Tech Roundup, this is typically how I'll sort of try and 360 it in my own mind, and then obviously, take it to my team and my co-hosts, and, we break it down and try and sort of figure out, how all the ways we can look at this without being sort of swept away by excitement, or without being overly cynical, or without looking like we're trying to raid on someone's parade, or without looking like we're too ready to declare a savior. And I think somewhere in the midst of all that is the way I think everyone should be thinking, which is, look, oversimplification is the enemy. I think we all just need to spend more time considering how all of these different things are interacting with each other, and perhaps true at the same time to varying degrees.
Mm. Wow. And I would say, that's what I love about like your show. Like, you approach each like headline or, topic with like lots of nuance, and you share like different perspectives, and it's not just like, we hate this, we love this, this is good, like that sort of thing. So I really do appreciate that. And I feel like with the smartphone thing, like I did some like reading up on it, and they did say that they are actually going to be like opening a plant in Durban as well, and like they plan to employ like 200 people, with like 60% women and like over 90% youth, which I thought was pretty cool, because I'm like, well, at least in like the short term, they're people have jobs, young people especially, who typically don't have too much access to like formal employment opportunities. At least they, are going to have something. And like you said, I hope it lasts as well, and I hope people support it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where the Mara group's going to be like in the next 10 years or so.
So that's interesting. Like, when you say you hope people will support it, I hope it'll be good. I hope they'll make good phones that people want, so that it won't be a hard sell. It won't need to be, let's back brand Africa, I also hope that the unit economics of that particular business will hold up, so that it's not just it's not a business that relies entirely on sort of political connections or, you know, certain incentives that they may or may not receive from governments in order to survive and things of that nature, which I understand are part of what make many of the world's biggest businesses thrive, you know. But I mean, one hopes that, you know, this thing grows and thrives on merit, that it has like proper mainstream appeal, that it has proper mainstream utility. In the same way, you know, I always think of a brand like Stadler. I don't know if you know Stadler pencils and pens, and they're a German brand.
Okay.
You know, they're found all over the world. You might have used one unwittingly and didn't know. I think they're typically red and black pencils. Striped.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yep. I've used one or used them
You've used
before.
one, and I think most people who've ever used a pencil, at least at some point in their lives, have used the Stadler pencil, and for me, that's that company. When you read up on it, I encourage anyone listening and you yourself. I mean, go research that company, how it's run, how it's stayed in private hands, how it stayed relevant, but also, you know, how it's, you know, continued to manufacture in Germany despite, you know, most pencils in the world being produced in China nowadays. I mean, it's just, it's just a fascinating case study to me of how, you know, an old school case study of how, you know, to think about building a business that will last a generation or more. And I think those are the kind of fundamentals that I hope, you know, businesses like the Mara Group, or anyone on the African continent integrates into their businesses, even just in terms of thinking or rhetoric, you know, so that, you know, we don't facilitate a culture of profiteering or like creating value, you know, or looking to capture value without actual value being created, you know. And I think on the flip side of that discussion, and the reason I'm going into it with such passion and perhaps, you know, speaking so long on it, is because, you know, we have a Jumuah at play, or at least on the demise at the moment, that I think is the embodiment of what happens when we don't apply our minds sufficiently and prudently to these matters.
Wow. I mean, that was like the perfect segue, because I did have some notes on Jumuah and I wanted to ask you a couple questions
Oh, wow.
about
Really?
them. And so, like, for those that don't know, is Jumuah essentially wants to be like the Amazon, right? Of, let's say, like Nigeria or West Africa or the entire continent?
No. If you
No.
ask them, they are the Amazon. Well, okay. To be fair, they might not have sort of called themselves that, but yes, they've definitely been touted as the Amazon of Africa, and it's not a moniker they've sort of shied away from. They're just like, oh yes, we're the biggest sort of e-commerce player on the continent. We're here for everybody, and so yeah, they made a splash by sort of listing on the New York Stock Exchange and selling the world this idea that Africa had finally arrived, you know. And that was so annoying for so many reasons. And yeah, I mean, I don't have time to go into each of them. But firstly, Jumuah is backed by, you know, foreign interests. It was founded by, you know, foreign players. And yes, they enlisted sort of local co-founders, quote unquote, to help run the business and launch it, and, you know, at varying points in their history. But they also, you know, spread themselves rather thinly across the continent, opening up offices and buying up smaller businesses in different geographies so that they could present this notion that they're in 27 plus odd countries or whatever it is.
Wow.
And, you know, so that, yeah, they could basically legitimately claim that they're sort of this Pan-African business, which technically they are, but in real terms, in almost every market, they have a competitor that does better than them. That story also oversimplifies just what it takes to succeed across different markets on the African continent, because countries are so different, you know? And so there are just so many problematic reasons why, it annoyed me and a lot of other people that these people would go, would sort of drag brand Africa into the world, claiming that they were both, I suppose, the next best thing since sliced bread on the continent, from the continent, and that they were positioning as the most bankable sort of startup unicorn, even by valuation, to invest in, when, like, they're actually a very shockingly run, business that's, losing money and mired in all sorts of controversies, and they're just not the best ambassadors for what our ecosystem is capable of producing, sustaining, and certainly what we aspire to putting forward as our sense of, or our contribution on the world stage. And so that's Jumuah, the way I see it. And so, the proof is, in this particular case, it's a situation of, far quickly than even I would have anticipated, the reality of just how difficult a time they're having at running a business is catching up with them, and sort of reflected in their share price, which has tanked far below the highs that they initially posted when they first launched on the stock exchange. And it's become a huge embarrassment. And what I once posted, I think on social media, even said in an interview at the time, was, just how readily are we as Africa going to be to embrace the fact that Africa is losing. I was challenging people who are just embracing the story as, oh, you wet blankets, you guys just don't want to see Jumuah shine, or, if this was a South African startup or an Egyptian startup and not a Nigerian startup, people would be more loving of it. And I'm like, no, this isn't about us sort of trying to to down our Nigerian brothers because that's where Jumuah was spawned. This is just trying to be prudent about who gets to say what about brand Africa and who gets to assert a narrative about our ecosystem. And Jumuah is just not the one. However hard and well PR'd they are, I refuse to identify with them as a poster child for our ecosystem, or the best of it anyway.
Right. Wow. Thank you for that. And what would you say they could have done right or done better? Like, do you think they just try to, scale too fast? Like, should they have just focused on Nigeria, gotten that like market together, and then maybe try to like expand into other countries? Like, what do you think they could have done differently?
Well, I think the problem starts far before what they did, like in sort of tactical terms, once the business was going. I'm laughing at myself here because I'm so predictable sometimes. I have concerns with the prevailing doctrine of venture capital that has been sold to the world by and large by Silicon Valley, and essentially this model creates a dynamic where people are rewarded, and by people I mean founders, investors are rewarded. There's a system that allows people to be rewarded to sort of make investments of time and money, and make profitable exits, whether or not real value has been created or indeed a real sustainable business has been created. And so it's a system that emphasizes hype and rewards whoever tells the best story and is able to sell it well. It's a system that also leverages very heavily on privilege, and by that I mean there are people who have the privilege of being able to use who they are or where they're from and their background or where they went to college to spin new ideas into existence and exit them before they have to deal with whether or not they were sustainable or good ideas to begin with. And I say this carefully because I think they're good ideas that should. I don't want to sound like I don't believe in people taking risks, and the whole idea of being venture backed, and people, there being a genre of money and investors who want to invest in untested, untried things. I think that should be there, but I think there's a sub-genre there's a subset of people in that space who know full well that the vast majority of ideas that are spawned in that space are by design never designed to be good businesses or sustainable ones or profitable ones. And they know full well that they're foolish people who are on the other side of when they've exited, who are going to have to bear the brunt of bad decisions and imprudent decisions. And they know full well often when they go in. And so, what does this have to do with Jumuah? Well, I'm sure a lot of the people who launched Jumuah were integrous and had like reasonable hopes that they would create the next Amazon of Africa. But I think at some point in that journey, it became apparent that the journey wasn't going to be as smooth or as straightforward as they had sold even their investors or themselves. And so IPOing was essentially their sort of last hope of exiting, before the entire ship sank, with something with a success they could at least point to as, hey, look, Africa can produce huge exits, put in this tiny little sum, spend a ton in between, but then you exit for a ton, and Africa does work. You see, African VC does work, and there's some people who backed Jumuah for that very reason. It was this opportunity to show the world that African venture capital was a true asset class, and Jumuah was going to be the proof. And I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think it's right to sort of try and prove that point at any cost. And Jumuah was just the wrong horse to back to try and prove that point to the world. And I think a lot of them knew it. A lot of the people involved with the company at varying points in its history knew at some point that there were some structural or sort of foundational issues with the business model, how quickly it could actually deliver value at scale, and to what extent the story they had sold investors to land the inordinate sums of money they've so far been able to raise. At some point, someone in the middle of a raise, pitching someone, knew full well that they would be taking this money, and there was no plausible way for it to return. Never mind return with a decent margin. So that's what I think of Jumuah. I think, you're asking me to go tactical in their team. See, I think they've been great people who have come in and out of work that business. I don't think the people who've worked the trenches of that business are stupid or naive. I think there are far too many smart people who've worked in the trenches of that business for me to assume that I can sit here and sort of, with the benefit of hindsight, go, oh, they should have done that tactically. I'm like the whole system that they were leveraging, and at some point, by my estimation, counting on to save them, even if the business didn't turn out to be a business, a viable one at scale. For me, that's where that's what I don't vibe with. That's what makes me mad when I think about it.
And that wraps it up. Thank you so much for listening in today, and thank you, Undu, for an amazing interview. We look forward to the next episode. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover next, please leave that in the comment section below and let us know. Don't forget to follow Boa54 on Facebook and Instagram, and share this video and channel with your family and friends. Also, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and the notification bell next to it so you can keep learning about Africa and you don't miss anything. And if you just subscribed, welcome to the family, and see you guys in the next video.